Hello, I'm Susanna Kerber, Chief Curator and Research Officer here at the Indiana State Museum and Historic Sites. And I'm down here in our textile storage area so that I can show you some of the treasures from the Lincoln Financial Foundation collection. We're very fortunate to be stewards of one of the largest Lincoln collections in the country, and we have some real treasures, and today we'll be focusing on the 1860 presidential election. So the first item I'm going to show you shows just how contested this election was. So this print depicts the most prominent figures who were considered in the running for the Republican nomination. In the middle, you will see William Seward of New York. He was considered the overwhelming favorite. And then you have a number of gentlemen from multiple states spanning the entire political spectrum. And down in the lower corner, right over here, is Abraham Lincoln, who was very much considered a dark horse. Well, Abraham Lincoln was very politically savvy, so he had gone on a speaking tour and made his reputation, gone and spoken at Cooper Union in New York, in the Northeast, had really established that he was someone to be considered very seriously. He was also in the center of the political spectrum, which helped him politically. But what really helped him was that he was very politically savvy and he had a lot of very smart floor managers. So the first thing that happened was that his allies got the Republican nominating convention placed in Chicago, supposedly as neutral ground. He was considered such an outside chance that nobody really took it seriously, that would give him the home field advantage. And then when they got to the convention, they had Illinois and Indiana solidly behind him, so they put him into nomination and seconded him. And then they went around to the other delegations and they convinced them that if their favorite candidate didn't advance, then that they support Lincoln as their second choice. And while Seward was way ahead on the first two ballots, Lincoln caught up, and on the third ballot, Lincoln became the nominee to many people's surprise. Now, a document that we have from that nominating convention that is very rare is what's called the Wigwam print. So they built a convention center specifically for this nominating convention, and they called it the Wigwam because that's where the chiefs of the Republican Party were meeting. And when Lincoln was nominated, his supporters had these prints ready to shower down on the public. And you can note there's a little pencil notation below this. This one was saved by Lincoln's personal secretary, John Nicolay, who noted that it was tossed out to the throngs. And there were throngs, more than 40,000 people came for the convention to celebrate Lincoln's nomination. This is actually a very rare print. In this earliest state, the one that was the first mass-produced image of Lincoln ever distributed, we actually have the only two known copies in the Lincoln Financial Foundation collection. Now I'm going to take you over here and show you some of the campaign materials. So there are a couple of things about the 1860 election that really distinguished it. The most important was that this was on the eve of the Civil War. The Democrats had actually split and nominated two candidates. This is Stephen Douglas, who was a perennial rival, also from Illinois, of Lincoln, and then John Breckinridge was the Southern Democratic candidate. Then another candidate, Bell, represented a third party, the Constitutional Union Party, and then Abraham Lincoln represented the Republicans. And this was only the second presidential election that the Republicans had been in because they were a fairly new coalition of a lot of older parties. So you can see here we have a couple of Abraham Lincoln items. We have one with his vice president, Hannibal Hamlin of Maine. Abolitionist figures, certainly slavery was the big topic here. Lincoln was against expanding slavery into the territories, but that still put him in the middle of the Republican Party. But he was for a lot of other things as well. Internal improvements, which we would call infrastructure now, tariffs, and the expansion of the railroad as part of those internal improvements, and the Homestead Act, so the idea that you could move out west and get cheap land. So those were his big campaign issues. What's really interesting is he didn't actually actively campaign for the presidency. The presidential candidates at this point did not campaign themselves. That would have looked too ambitious. In fact, Stephen Douglas did go out on the stump and he was criticized for it, made fun of. But that didn't mean that they weren't working very hard through proxies and through big parades, all kinds of flags, medals, ribbons. There was a lot of hoopla, but the candidates stayed close to home and they didn't say anything. This also had the advantage that nobody could point out that they said something they disagreed with or they contradicted themselves, said Lincoln didn't write anything, he didn't say anything. He was quiet all the way from the May nominating convention to his election. But he had a lot of supporters. So Seward, his chief rival for the nomination, who he later made his Secretary of State, actually went on a 9-state speaking tour for him. And at those stops, Seward would have been met by wide awakes, where Lincoln and the Republicans enthusiastic parade corps you could think of. But these were huge crowds of enthusiastic young men, mostly wearing capes and hats and carrying torches, which made a pretty spectacular sight. And while some of the torches were very plain, this is actually a wide awake torch that would have been on a long pole, and you can see where the flames would have come out from the shoulders or the wings of the eagle. And here we have a poster for a rally in Brookville, Indiana, in Franklin County. And again, you have, it's for Lincoln and Hamlin. So they have speakers, including electors and local politicians, and the wide awakes. And to give you some idea how big these groups could be, a wide awake parade that went past the Lincoln home in Springfield was 2 miles long. They were in all size communities too. This is a ribbon for Lincoln and Hamlin and the wide awakes from Seneca Falls. The other candidates, they also had big parades, but not as big as Lincoln's. And a small group of Douglas supporters actually dubbed themselves the chloroformers, that they were going to put the wide awakes to sleep, but clearly that didn't work. A lot of the myths about Lincoln that we think of really came out of that campaign, the 1860 campaign. So to end, I want to focus on one particular image that is also very close to our history of Lincoln here in Indiana, and that is Lincoln as the rail splitter. So here you have a ribbon that says the rail splitter of 1830, which is when he would have reached his majority at age 21, and also moved from Indiana to Illinois. The President of the US, 1861. So this is actually a ribbon after his election. At the nominating convention in Chicago and its subsequent events, supporters would carry around rails, supposedly split by Lincoln, though he was always very careful not to claim that he had actually split all of those rails. And then sometimes those rails would be made into canes for the supporters and treasured. So this is a cane made from one of those rails used during the campaign, and it belonged to the Moffett family. Moffett was an Illinois state legislator and a friend of Lincoln's. In the museum, in the galleries, you can see a mallet, which was actually the rail splitter's rail splitter, because it was a rail splitting maul before it broke in half, and he repurposed it as a bench mallet. So that rail splitting image and the reality of the hard work and that pioneer spirit that it conjured up very much went to Lincoln's youth, but it also became a very powerful symbol of how he was the everyman and would represent the common people.